Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. You know, if you've ever found yourself completely scratching your head while reading the epistles of Paul, trust me, you are definitely not alone. His letters are absolutely brilliant, but man, they are incredibly dense. So today, we're going to look at how our source text builds a highly practical first-century study guide specifically for reading Paul's epistles. The whole goal of the source here is to strip away centuries of assumption and really look at these letters through the original Hebraic lens they were written in. So grab your notes, because we're going to unlock this together.
Okay, let's dive right into our syllabus. We'll start with Peter's prophetic warning, define what it means to be unlearned and unstable, navigate some of those hard concepts, break down the study guide grid, and finally, apply the rules.
Section 1. Peter's prophetic warning. Basically, the warning label on Paul's letters.
Now, history actually gives us a built-in warning label for Paul's dense theological letters, and it comes straight from another foundational figure in the early assembly, Cephas, or as we know him, Peter. Our source text points us directly to 2 Peter 3:15-16. Here, Peter is writing about Paul's epistles, and he flat out says that in them are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest unto their own destruction. The source positions this as a really stark prophetic warning against a dangerous trend. It's a warning against interpreting Paul as the champion of some entirely new religion that somehow abolished the laws of Yahweh. Peter's acknowledging right out of the gate that Paul is operating at a very high level of theological complexity.
Section 2. The unlearned and unstable. Let's define these pitfalls.
To really grasp Peter's warning, the source insists that we can't just rely on modern dictionary definitions. We literally have to translate our English vocabulary back into its first-century Hebraic context. So what does it mean to be unlearned? To us today, it just sounds like someone who, doesn't have a university degree. But in that first-century Hebraic context, the source argues that being unlearned meant being completely ignorant of the foundational instructions, judgments, and testimonies of the Torah. Think about it. Paul was a Pharisee. He trained at the feet of Gamaliel. His logic is super dense and relies heavily on legal precedents from the Torah. If a reader is unlearned in those foundational laws, well, they're practically guaranteed to misunderstand his complex arguments.
And this brilliantly illustrates the harmony the source is pointing out. When an unlearned person reads Paul saying the Messiah is the end of the law, they immediately think, oh, it means the law is abolished. But with the Torah as a foundation, they'd realize the original Greek word telos actually means the aim or the target. Yashua is the goal toward which the Torah points. Matthew 5:17 backs this up perfectly. He didn't come to destroy the law, he came to fulfill it.
Okay, next up is the word unstable. According to our source, from a Hebraic perspective, spiritual stability comes exclusively from one place, anchoring your faith in the active obedience to Yah's commandments. It's exactly like building your house on a solid rock instead of shifting sand. Without that anchor of the Torah, a believer is easily tossed to and fro, swayed by smooth words or modern human philosophies, which completely takes Paul's deeply nuanced arguments totally out of context.
So, what actually happens when the unlearned and unstable read Paul? Well, Peter says they wrest his words. This translates from the Greek word streblu, which literally means to torture, rack, or twist out of shape. And our source highlights something absolutely vital here. Peter notes they do this to Paul's letters as they do to the other scriptures. Now, in the first century, scripture explicitly meant the Tanakh, the Old Testament. By saying this, Peter is elevating Paul's writings to the level of Scripture, meaning they have to be subjected to the exact same strict interpretive rules as the rest of the Bible.
Which brings us to a huge rule of interpretation presented in the text. Later Scripture absolutely cannot contradict earlier Scripture. Yahweh's word is uniform. If Paul were actually teaching that the Torah is dead, or that dietary laws and Sabbaths are obsolete, he would fail the Deuteronomy 13 test of a false prophet. A prophet who tells you to forsake the commandments. By twisting or wresting Paul's words, readers are actually forcing him into a massive contradiction with the rest of the Bible.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is understanding the terrifying stakes of making this mistake. Peter says this twisting leads to their own destruction. The source points directly to Matthew 7, where Yashua actually turns away believers who performed miracles and called him master, telling them to depart because they work iniquity. That word in Greek is anomia, literally translating to lawlessness or being anti-Torah. Twisting Paul to justify abandoning the law has massive, destructive spiritual consequences.
Section 3. Navigating hard concepts. Let's disarm some of these landmines.
If we really want to guard ourselves, we have to look squarely at what is actually so hard to understand in Paul's epistles. Now, what's really fascinating here is how historical context completely flips our understanding of that famous Pauline phrase, works of the law. The modern view generally assumes this is Paul commanding believers to stop obeying the Torah entirely. But the source reveals that archaeological discoveries, specifically Dead Sea Scrolls like the 4QMMT document, show works of the law was actually a very specific first-century Hebrew legal idiom. It referred to sectarian legalistic rulings regarding conversion and purity. So Paul was arguing against a false premise of ritual conversion, not against obeying God's foundational moral laws.
Another massive landmine? Circumcision. When Paul says things like, "If ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing," it sounds like he's straight up forbidding an eternal covenant. But our source reconciles this by looking closely at his audience. Paul was combating the circumcision party, a specific group demanding the physical ritual as a strict, legal prerequisite for salvation. Paul's issue wasn't the physical act itself. He literally circumcised Timothy. His issue was using it as a mechanism to earn salvation, rather than relying on faith, which then produces an obedient heart.
Section 4, the Study Guide Grid. This is the master key for reading Paul.
All right, this brings us to the absolute climax of our explainer. The source provides a concrete, three-part rubric to safely navigate any of Paul's epistles so we don't fall into the traps we just talked about. This is your master key. First, the foundation rule. It's grounded in Malachi 3:6, which says God does not change. The application? If Paul seems to contradict Moses or the prophets, you need to reread Paul. Second, the audience rule. Remember, Paul is writing to ex-pagan Gentiles trying to navigate their new identity without falling into sectarian legalism or sliding backward into paganism. Context is literally everything. Third, the definition rule. Grounded in 1 John 3:4, you must use scriptural definitions for the words you're reading. Sin is explicitly defined as the transgression of the law. We have to use this grid as a filter to prevent exactly that theological instability Peter warned us about.
Section 5, applying the rules. Let's see how this builds and test the methodology.
Let's actually put this to the test by applying our newly established grid methodology to one of the most famously debated verses in the entire New Testament. The verse is Romans 6:14. "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law but under grace." Now, we've got to acknowledge that without our first century context, an unlearned reading easily looks at not under the law and excitedly concludes that believers no longer have any obligation to keep the Torah whatsoever.
But applying our methodology changes everything. The unstable reader says, hey, we don't have to keep the law, but let's use the definition rule. Scripturally, sin is defined as breaking the Torah. In the very next verse, Paul asks, shall we sin? Shall we break the Torah because we are under grace? God forbid. So our rules grid shows us that being under the law in this specific context means being under its condemnation and penalty, which is death. We're freed from the penalty of the law through grace. As the source beautifully puts it, if a judge pardons a criminal, freeing them from the penalty of the law, he certainly doesn't expect them to walk out of the courtroom and immediately break the law again.
When we clear away the biases and actually use this study guide, the source reveals a profound harmony. As Paul instructed Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15 to rightly divide the word of truth, we have to remember that at the time he wrote that, the word of truth was the Tanakh. There is perfect harmony between Cephas, Paul, and Yashua. They all honored the exact same Torah. Paul's writings are an amazing, brilliant gift, but they require a mind anchored in foundational scripture to be understood correctly.
Which brings us to our final thought. The warning from Peter is both a shield and a wake-up call for how we approach our studies. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder on your own scriptural journey. Are you reading Paul through the steadfast lens of the Torah, or are you twisting the Torah through the lens of Paul? Think on that as you apply this study guide grid moving forward. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and happy studying.